Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Sprackland podcast. I am a woman on a mission to gather a cadre of writers, thinkers, and teachers who are transforming the world, one character at a time. And it all starts with one thing, a deep understanding of human motivation, why people do what they do, and the forces that drive them. But I'm still in the world of Zettelkasten, and we are back in our series on Adler, How to Read a Book. If this book is not in your library, you have a big hole in the library. Well, we are now in the section on analytical reading, and specifically, we are going to be working in Chapter 6, Pigeonholing a Book. This particular area is not long on gathering material out of the book. It's more about forming an impression of the book, and therefore, there's not a lot of direct information about what we're going to take out of a book and put into the Zettelkasten from our target book. So therefore, and I'm going to be covering it from the standpoint of making main cards out of the book to go into the Zettelkasten. It's material that's worth covering, and I don't want to skip over it. So that is how we're going to handle it. So you're going to get to see the main cards that I have made out of Chapter 6, Pigeonholing a Book, in Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book. So meet me over in the down-facing camera, and we'll get going. Okay, here we are in Chapter 6, Pigeonholing a Book. If you're following along, we're on page 59. So this is basically about determining what kind of a book you're reading. So let's go over to the next page. Mortimer Adler begins with the importance of classifying books. And basically he says that as your first step in analytical reading, you're going to want to ask the question, what kind of a book are you reading? And he talks about fiction, and he brings up several different examples showing that fiction might be a little fuzzy topic because it might actually be a psychoanalytic study. It might be a historical study, persuasive or sociological, all under the banner of fiction. But that's about all he covers as to fiction. And we're left with the idea that nonfiction is far broader. So in a continuation of this topic, as he answers the question, well, how are you going to answer the question of what kind of book are you reading? The way to find that is going to be to look at the title and the preface. Since these 2 points made one topic, one thought, I carried it over to a second card, and also I would need the second card in any case to include my reflection. And my reflection was that this goes back to a step in inspectional reading where we were asked to take a look at the title and the preface as well there. So how does this differ? And that's just a question that I'll keep in the back of my mind. Then I noticed in the book that all of part 3 is devoted to different kinds of books, and I suspect that this is where he's going to end up going into a lot more depth than what he's going to cover right here. So to orient myself, I went ahead and looked at the chapters in part 3 of the book, and I just listed the titles of the chapters of that part. Practical books, imaginative literature, stories, plays, and poems, history, science and mathematics, philosophy, and social science. So those are some of the kinds of the book that he's going to deal with later. And I noticed that before he finished this topic, he said he was going to give us some guidelines for classification. So I'm waiting with interest for that. Let me make a note here about my tagline, which I use for a memory prompt phrase. What, besides topics, will help us pigeonhole a book? Now, I picked that word pigeonhole because that's his chapter title, but when I'm trying to remember this card and look it back up in the index, that word pigeonhole might not come back to me, and so I wrote above it, classify. Now, what I will do when I index this card is I will index it under topic with what besides topics will help us pigeonhole a book. Then I'll index it under pigeonhole with that whole phrase, under book with that whole phrase, and under classify with a slightly modified phrase. What besides topic will help us classify a book? So at this point, we're on page 65 in a section that he calls Practical versus Theoretical Books. And I prefaced this section by saying that he has promised us guidelines how to categorize a book, and he's given us two, practical versus theoretical. And as I read the paragraphs, he's basically contrasting action as practical, knowledge as theoretical, applied science as practical, pure science as theoretical, purpose questions as coming out of practical, validity questions as coming out of theoretical. So in my response, I noted that the first division in pigeonholing a book from part 3 is practical book. So it seems to me that this practical category is not going to be subdivided further. My tagline, again, is one of these with multiple phrases. Functionality and understanding correspond to practical and theoretical books. And then I'll have another one. Action and knowledge correspond to practical and theoretical books. So this means going to be using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different entries in my index. Now we're here on page 70, which is the kinds of theoretical books. And not surprisingly, we're not seeing kinds of practical books, just of theoretical books. And the types of theoretical books that Mortimer Adler cites, and I've switched to blue ink here because I'm quoting him, the traditional subdivisions of theoretical books are history, science, and philosophy, and he refers to these as rough approximation. And I pulled out his how to classify history, are events in time and place, science, observations outside our normal experience, and philosophy, things inside our normal experience reflected on. So I've noticed at this point that in all of this so far, we're not seeing why all these distinctions are needed. So this is a note to myself to keep an eye open as I conclude this chapter. Finally, as the chapter is winding down, on page 73, the next to the last page of the chapter, and 74, the final page of the chapter, he begins to tell us his why. And I make note of that in my own comment. Adler finally tells us his why. And he says, is the classification of books really all that important? And he points out that teaching styles differ for each type, and so learning styles must also differ. He invited us to imagine ourselves going into a classroom of each type and noting what we would see different in the teaching styles. Well, in school, I was math science all the way. I hated history and I skipped philosophy, so I couldn't really pull too much from my own experience and say, yeah, I remember how different those classes were. So for me, this is going to be partly discovery. So I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Chapter 6 of Adler's How to Read a Book as we launch into analytical reading. I hope you enjoyed the different main cards that I made for the book. So now I have an adventure left because I still have to file these cards. And to me, that is at least half of the fun because it's so much fun as I go through my index. First, I go through the index to find where the card is going to join in the cards. Each one gets to pick its own parent. And then I get to go back to my index and repeatedly enter my tagline to track this card so that I can find it again. So I hope you will do the same. I hope you will get some benefit out of this, and we will proceed with Chapter 7, How to X-Ray a Book, next. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.